Dagda Bard Jon. Hi and hello, it's John here from the Irish Pagan School with another folklore, well, no, not folklore, mythology video. Yes, because I was reading some folklore earlier, but we're actually going to touch base on some of the Irish mythology. And one of the main things that a lot of people look at is the four treasures of the Tuatha De Danann. So if you're interested in that, do make sure you stick around. If not, we have loads of other videos there in our thread and lists and stuff like that. So I'm sure there'll be something for you if you're interested in Irish paganism, which is why you're here, which is what the Irish Pagan School is about. So again, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for kind of connecting with us in the comments and with the liking and the subscribing. It's making a big difference to the visibility of these videos and making sure that they're getting to the people who really are interested in this kind of stuff and will want to know more. So the four treasures of the Tuatha De Danann. What are they? Where do they come from? And who are they connected to? So essentially, I could answer it all in one kind of just run. But there, as with all of these Irish mythology and Irish story, there's more to kind of tease out and to kind of figure out. And then when we see the people in the stories and how those items kind of are even used, but not even, or not used, not mentioned, it's always very fascinating to me. So the first thing we need to kind of track back is to the origins of the mythological era in Ireland. Now, we know that there was, according to the story, because this is all one big story, it's called Laura Gabala Éireann, or the Book of Taking of Ireland, or the Book of Invasions, by another definition or translation. And what the earlier works of this kind of lore talked about really is Ireland's origin story. Now, unlike some other kind of places or nations, we don't have this kind of core origin story like of where the gods came from or how the gods made the earth or how the gods kind of like arrived like creation wise. All we have really is that Ireland existed. There was Ireland, and then into Ireland came the different kind of tribes. So we have some tribes that we don't have a lot of information about anymore. There was the Caesarians, the Partholonians, and the Numidians. It does say that the Caesarians were wiped out by a plague. The Partholonians were wiped out by the flood, as in the great Noah-esque flood. And it was then, wait, hold on, am I getting this the wrong way around? I think it's the Partholonians who were in first, then the Caesarians, and they were wiped out by the flood. And then we had the Numidians, and the Numidians are the Nemid, as in the Den, which kind of is the ancestors or forebears of the Tuatha De Danann and the Firbolg, actually. So what we have then at that particular point in the mythology is this one tribe in Ireland who was suffering oppression from Fomorians. And so the three sons of Nemid went to the wise one, the wise person of their story, and Fintan, who was one of the precursors, the one who had survived from the flood. He was one of the only people to survive. And so they were like, hey, what do we do with this oppression? And he's like, lads, you better just leave. And so the origin stories of this is that the different brothers gathered up their tribes, gathered up their people, and went out of Ireland into other lands. And this is where we have the origins of the groups. And so it was Simeon who went down to like Greece, and his kind of tribe survived and flourished through adversity in Greece and became the Firbolg before they returned. But it was, I think his name is Bohak, I'm not pronouncing that right, who went into the north out of Ireland, it said. And it was said that his tribe grew and kind of flourished in these islands off to the north and east of Ireland. And they then, as a tribe fleeing from that area, returned into Ireland as the Tuatha De Danann, as the tribe of Danu, or De Danann, because it's Danu, a goddess, not Danube, the river in Germany. So there's a lot of kind of stuff in this, which is really fascinating. And I've kind of gotten off track, but I've given you a bit of an insight because it's the story of the descendants of Bohak of the Nemid that went into the north and east, who became the Tuatha De Danann. And when we have them later in the lore returning to Ireland, it says that they left from 4 great cities. And those 4 cities were Findius, Falius, Gorius, and Murius. And so we have the name of these four great cities, and it was said that each of the cities was overseen by a poet, a prophet, or a seer. And as in, like, there was one head in each of these cities that was both poet and seer, both prophet and poet. And those were, oh gosh, I'm gonna I will find the names of them and I will kind of put it in. But essentially, there was these four great cities, and in them were four individuals who kind of were not kings, not monarchs in that sense, not kind of, it wasn't that kind of power structure. It was like the guiding influence, like the elders, the kind of like the knowledgeable ones. And so when the Tuatha De Danann, when the people were gathering to become one people, to then emigrate and return to Ireland, and the four kind of leaders of those four great cities gave them four treasures, one from each city. And that's where we get these four treasures of the Tuatha De Danann. So from Findius was brought the sword known as An Cleave Sullus, and it was said that this sword, once drawn from its scabbard, no battle could be held against it. It was then from Gorias was brought the spear, and it was said that once presented, no conquest could be had against it. Then we had from Folius was brought the stone, the stone known as the Leopold, or the stone of sovereignty or destiny. And then the fourth came from Murias, which was the cauldron of the Dagda, from which no company would go unsatisfied. And that's kind of all of the information we have about the cities, about like the druid seers or leaders, and then about these items. Now, there's kind of like confusion between Gorius and Findius and the sword and the spear, because they both seem to be weapons. They both seem to say the same thing. And so some people say that like the spear came from Gorius or the spear came from Findius, and it's the other way around. All of that really gets caught in translation. But what it really does come down to is the language itself, because you might say no battle being able to stood against the sword, or no conquest being able to had against the spear. Seems like the same thing, but one thing I have kind of gone through the information myself, but also kind of listened to other people who have translated. One of my favorite translators, I've mentioned them a number of times, Morgan Daimler. Morgan and I have bounced back on it a couple of times, and I've read Morgan's work on it, and I agree that there is a difference between winning a battle with the go forward aggression, say, of a sword, and holding against a battle with the somewhat defensive position of a spear. And so from my understanding of it, that there is the difference between sword and spear. Now, both of them were said to drop mortal wounds, and this was a unique difference in regards to combat, because there was wounds, and then there was mortal wounds. A mortal wound was a guaranteed kill. Even if the person kind of walked away from it, even if the person kind of lived for years afterwards, they carried a mortal wound and they were going to die of that wound. So we see that mentioned a number of different times, and also in the context of the Tuatha De Danann, specifically in Dinchecht, who was their leech or their surgeon or healer, the great healer, because he and his children had an ability to heal mortal wounds. And that was one of the defining differences between them and the other tribes. That was one of the big linchpin things that during the first battle of Moytura, where the Tuatha De Danann struggled for dominance in Ireland against the Firbolg, the Firbolg suffering mortal wounds would carry those mortal wounds and then die. Whereas at the end of each day, when Tuatha De Danann warriors suffering mortal wounds returned to camp, they went into like a healing spring or a holy bath or well, not holy, holly was one of the herbs. There was a number of different herbs that were scattered into this water trough, really. And we don't have an exact list of those herbs. I wish I did. But then warriors submerged in that would come up from it again, and all of their wounds would be like restored. Mortal wounds would be restored. People on the edge of death could be restored. And the only thing that would actually not be able to be restored was decapitation. And that's why during the stories, that's why during the first battle of Moytura, there is mention of warriors taking heads, as in, like, you know, at the end of this particular day, this champion slew this champion and brought their head back to their tribe. That is like a guaranteed no coming back from it. So that's more than a mortal wound, that is death. So both the sword and the spear were capable of this mortal wounds, or delivering mortal wounds from them. The interesting thing, though, specifically when we're talking about the sword, is that Nuada is the king in Ireland at the time of the first battle of Moytura, and Nuada is the chieftain who's carrying on Cleave Sulis. He is carrying this sword of light, or this like sword that drops magical wounds, mortal wounds, that no one can be victorious against. But he loses. During the first battle of Moytura, Nuada faces off against a champion amongst the Fair Bolg, Shreng, and Shreng, son of Slenga, beats him and severs Nuada's arm. And so, as much as we have this mention of this sword being with Nuada, it doesn't kind of always show every time throughout the story that he's just then unbeatable and unkillable. He actually does lose, and he himself suffers. It would be a mortal wound, except for Dean Hex being there, but it's considered a blemish, which means he's no longer physically whole, and that would mean he was no longer fit to be king. So I could talk more about the transition of power from the first battle and the second battle of Moytura. In fact, I did a class on that. It's called The Taking of Ireland, exploring the differences between the Tuatha De Danann returning into Ireland and battling it for Bullock, and then the Milesians coming into Ireland and battling the Tuatha De Danann, and how those two different conflicts seem to take on different roles for power transition. So fascinating subject, but we're talking about treasures here. We're talking about 4 treasures. And so that is the sword. Like, there is no further mention that we know of as yet of the feats of that sword. There is another sword which is said to like cleave through armor and kind of cut through stuff, that is actually with Lugh, but that sword was given him. That sword is not one of the treasures of the Tuatha De Danann. That sword actually was given to him by Monaghan MacLear, because if you caught my other video about Lugh, there's these kind of 2 origin stories of Lugh based on the different versions of the tales. And in one of those origin tales, in one of those kind of versions of it, Monaghan MacLear is Lugh's foster father. And so Monaghan gives Lugh his own personal sword, which is this magical sword called Fragarach, which is pretty much answerer. So he has this amazing magic sword which would cut through any kind of armor at all. It could not be stopped. But that is not the same sword as on Cleave Sulis, because we know that one has its own name, Fragarach. And the naming of things is very, very important, as we've kind of touched on in other videos, and hopefully I've made clear with my talk on being a bard. Naming things gives it definition and gives it power. So that is the sword and kind of the spear. We don't have other references to the spear, but if we look at Lugh's particular story, if he's carrying this spear against which battles cannot be like overcome, like you can't overcome him when he has the spear, is that then the weapon that he used to slay Kermit, the Dagda's son? Is that why it was a mortal wound that Dagda himself had no ability to restore? But, you know, if it was a mortal wound, why couldn't Dean Kecht heal it? Why was it a death wound which forced Dagda to leave Ireland and find the club? So there is all of this area of kind of question that I love to kind of go through and love to kind of chew over and analyze. Because Kermit, being the son of the Dagda, it's actually Kermit's 3 sons who later become the 3 kings of Ireland before the Milesians return. But before they step into the role as kings, they are actually just 3 vengeful youths, and they go and they seek vengeance against Lugh for him having killed their father. Even though their father was brought back to life by their granddad, the Dagda, they still went and killed Lugh. And they battled Lugh. All 3 of them fought against Lugh, and it was said that Lugh couldn't overcome them. And Lugh kind of fled from them, having taken some wounds, and he drowned in a lake. And that was the end of Lugh. So if he had this spear against which no one can overcome, then why did he lose? You know, why was that need for his death and the end of that story? So as much as we have this talk of the treasures and how powerful they are, they're not some kind of plot armor. They're not some kind of magical guarantee of success, as we've seen. The other two are the Cauldron of the Dagda, as I mentioned, and the only thing it says is that no company goes from it unsatisfied. The difficulty we get is that looking at cauldrons in mythology in Ireland, and then also in, say, the Welsh mythology, which is very close, because then you also have the Welsh saga known as the Mabinogi, which deals with both Wales and Ireland and a relationship and a conflict and an exchange of wedding gifts, in essence, one of which is a cauldron, the Cauldron of Bran. And that cauldron was said to, if you put someone inside the cauldron, they would be brought back to life. So people kind of, again, look at these tales and say, well, that must be the same as this, or this must be that, or maybe that is this. It's all good to have postulation, to consider, to kind of bend your brain around it. But it's very important to make sure where the definitions are and where the actual clear kind of, this is my unique or unverified personal gnosis regarding this, as opposed to someone definitively saying, well, obviously that's the cauldron, that was the treasure of the Tuatha De Danann. It's not made clear anywhere in the root lore itself that that is the fact. But we know then that people coming to the Dagda, people coming to the Dagda's fire, the Dagda's hearth, and company was a particular, it wasn't just a visitor, company was a gathering or a collection. So a company could be a number of nines, in essence. Like by a nine, a lot of groups of warriors were formed into a nine. And we see it time and again during the conflicts in Moytura 1 and 2. There's feats of like harm being placed where, you know, a single strike of a champion would fell a 9, or where, like, you know, a warrior would gather up his group and they would gather as a 9. So there is some structure around that idea of 9s, but a company was a multitude of 9s. So it would almost be like an entire host could arrive and no one would go away unsatisfied. So it links to this idea of cornucopia, or this kind of undry cauldron, or ever kind of flowing cauldron. And that is one thing of it. Like, people think that the Cauldron of the Dagda has a name called Undri. That's actually just a misunderstanding and a mistranslation, because it's actually undry, that the cauldron was never dry, it was never empty. So it's not named Undri. The only name we have of that cauldron is the Cauldron of the Dagda, which is a very interesting conflict in itself, because we have this Cauldron of the Dagda coming out of Murias, which was interestingly referred to as the Fortress of Pinnacles, the place from which all battles were won outside. So lovely piece of information. And for me, a person who studies at Dagda and studies everything about that, the idea that it is this fortress up on top of mountains, and no one ever broke, or no one ever carried a siege against the fortress, especially if they had a cauldron inside that fortress that could always sustain their people. So he has this kind of cauldron, and it's called the Cauldron of the Dagda, that came out of Murias. But it's only during the Second Battle of Moytura, which is a long while later, after the Tuatha De Danann arrive into Ireland, they battle against the Firbolg, they get dominance of Ireland, Brest becomes king, Brest proves to be a bad king, Nuada gets restored, Nuada becomes king, Nuada steps aside for Lugh, who becomes king, and then there's 3 years where the Nuada, Dinkecht, Gwivnu, and Olma, and Dagda all go off to talk and prepare for battle. And it's there that he's referred to as, on Dagda, like the good god or the good hand, because he is capable of doing all of the things that is promised. So he is the Dagda, because it says that, and the name stuck to him ever since from then. So whether or not it was him all the way through, and they then clarified that it was his cauldron beforehand or afterwards, there's that kind of confluence, this whole wibbly wobbly timey-wimey thing that makes it very difficult and challenging to analyze, because we have Dagda getting his naming as the Dagda so much later in the lore, but we have reference to the Cauldron of the Dagda existing as one of the 4 treasures of the Tuatha De Danann when it is brought out of the city of Murias, when the Tuatha De Danann made their journey, their kind of return into Ireland. So I don't have an answer for that. And Dagda has many other names, many other names. And maybe I'll do a separate video on the names of the Dagda, because some of that's fascinating and very funny as well. And it's a good insight into him as a character. It's good insight to get an idea of who he is. And I still don't have a final answer for that because I'm learning more and more as I go through the understanding of his names. But we're not talking Dagda names. So that's the cauldron of the Dagda. That is what we have on it. And the last then is the Leopold, the stone of destiny or stone of sovereignty. This one came out of Falius. Actually, for a time, Ireland itself, before it got the name Éireann from the goddess Eru, was actually called Inishfal, as in the island of sovereignty or the island of destiny. And that's because of this stone. So the stone was actually taken and it was placed upon a very specific place in Ireland. And it was said that that was the main location. That was this kind of confluence of important resonances that meant that the stone could do its job linking with the landscape. And its job was to announce the rightful king of Ireland. And it was said then that when a king passed away, all of the people who were throwing their hat in the ring, really, or stepping forward to see if they are worthy to be the king, would have to go through a number of trials, would have to go through a number of kind of tests of worth within their own families, within their own clan, within their own tua, within like their own kind of conflicts between tuas, to then put forward a person to attempt it. But the final say as to who was worthy to be the king was on dawn of a particular day, where the person would stand atop the stone of destiny, the Leopold, and it was said that the stone would roar with the voice of Ireland if the person standing on it was worthy. And so as far as, you know, people and people kind of choosing their leaders, people choosing their rulers, you know, the complexity of who we are as human beings, and, you know, even our ancestors and deities or whatever, there's always this complexity because we're all multifaceted creatures. The idea that the final say would have to come from the earth itself, would have to come from the land itself, really adds a whole extra level of resonance and rightness and connection. And it was that particular bond really that made that bound, that linked the life and the journey of a king to the land, in that if a king was right and righteous and ruled fairly and justly, then the land would be abundant and it would be safe, would be prosperous, and it would be overflowing with good fortune and wealth. But if a king ruled poorly, if they gave false judgment, if they were not meeting the rules of hospitality, if they were not functioning in honor and honesty and correct or corquivness, this right relationship with their people and with the land itself and with the other world, then there would be the reversal of that fortune. Like the land would become a wasteland. It would become a terrible kind of circumstance. There would be no abundance. There would be plague and destitution, etc., which could lead to the people choosing to remove that king from power. And there are kind of records. There's a number of different amazing archaeological finds, like the bog bodies around Ireland, some of which are postulated to be failed rulers in particular areas being removed from power and then sacrificed to the land itself to make amends. So I've slipped a little bit aside into archaeology and into history, which it's also interwoven. You can't really talk about this stuff without understanding how strongly it informs our people today, our national identity, our national heritage, and the very, as I said, the landscape itself. If you wanted to go to the place where Dagda dug the ditches for Rathbres, that's the Hill of Tara. If you wanted to go to the place where Angus kind of won the brew from Elkmar, that's the Boyne Valley, that's Newgrange, all of that area, Nouth and Douth is Angus land. If you want to go and see where Macha raced the horses, you know, during the later Iron Age against Concover, that is Owen Macha up in Northern Ireland. These places are real. They exist in our landscape. If you want to go see where Maeve, I couldn't not say Maeve in this, but, you know, Tulsk, go to Roscommon, go to Rathcrohan, you can see the mound and you can see the fantastic view from atop that mound. And it gives such an idea of scope, because Maeve called the warriors of Ireland, pretty much anyone who owed her anything turned up. The only ones who didn't, in fact, sorry, there were people who from Ulster who were in her army, Fergus and his troops. And so, like, yeah, all of this mythology, all of this lore, all of this archaeology is so real to us because it's still so present in our landscape and so present in the names of our towns and our country. There's so many names of towns in Ireland that carry bull connotations because of the white bull who killed the brown bull and then ran all the way around Ireland, kind of dropping bits of bull carcass. So there's parts around Ireland where it's known as the Ford of the Bull leg, you know, as a translation, because that's where apparently that part of it fell off. And that's why these stories are so real. That's why it's so important. And that's why it's great to be able to do this, to be able to kind of sit with you and to have so many amazing comments coming back to us about people learning something they didn't know before, getting a different perspective about things, or just even hearing some of the stories for the first time. So I'm really, really grateful to be able to do this. Thank you very, very much for being with us at the Irish Pagan School. And if you found something in this interesting, let me know. If there's something that you think I missed and didn't talk about, let me know. Or if there's something that you would like me to talk about more, please do throw a comment on there. And as ever, do the like and the subscribe. And if you thought this could be of use to someone else out there, if you've heard someone get confused about the sword and the spear, or, you know, someone need to know about the four treasures, then pop them the link and share it with them as well. So as ever, from all of us here in the Irish Pagan School, thank you very much for being with us. And until next time, look after yourself and slán.